I should have known something was wrong the moment my daughter-in-law invited me to Thanksgiving with a smile that was just a little too sweet. My name is Margaret Whitmore, I'm 67 years old, and I've hosted more Thanksgiving dinners than I can count, but last year was the first time in 4 decades I wasn't the one cooking the turkey. Instead, my son Daniel and his wife Ashley insisted I come to their house outside Columbus, Ohio, saying they wanted to give Mom a break for once. That alone should have made me suspicious. For years Ashley had treated family gatherings like polite obligations, always friendly enough but never warm, always quick to leave the kitchen the moment the dishes were done. So when she called me 2 weeks before Thanksgiving sounding cheerful and telling me how excited she was to host, I remember standing in my small kitchen with the phone in my hand thinking how strange it sounded. Still, I told myself maybe things were finally getting better between us. I baked a pecan pie that morning, the same recipe my mother taught me back in 1975, wrapped it carefully in foil, and drove the 25 miles to their neighborhood just before sunset. The air smelled like wood smoke and cold leaves, the kind of late November evening that usually makes a person feel grateful for family. Their house looked warm from the outside, lights glowing through the windows, and for a moment I felt hopeful as I carried the pie up the front steps. Daniel opened the door and gave me a quick hug, but it was the kind of hug where someone pats your back twice and pulls away too fast. Ashley appeared behind him almost immediately, smiling brightly and taking the pie from my hands like a hostess greeting a guest at a restaurant. "Margaret, you made it," she said in that careful voice she uses when other people are listening. I stepped inside and noticed something odd right away. Usually Thanksgiving at their place meant noise, football on the television, people drifting between the living room and the kitchen. But that evening the house felt strangely organized, almost staged. The dining table was already set even though dinner hadn't been served yet, and several members of the extended family were sitting quietly in the living room instead of chatting around the kitchen island. Daniel's cousin Mark nodded to me, but his smile faded quickly, like he wasn't sure what expression he was supposed to wear. Ashley guided me toward the living room with a light touch on my arm, and that's when I saw it. In the center of the room, between the couch and the armchairs, someone had placed a single wooden chair facing everyone else, almost like the seat at the front of a meeting. At first I thought maybe they had been rearranging furniture for more space, but no one moved the chair when I walked in. Instead, the room grew quiet in that polite, uncomfortable way people get when something serious is about to happen. I laughed softly and said, "Well, this is different," expecting someone to explain the strange setup. No one did. Ashley just smiled again, the same tight smile, and said, "Margaret, why don't you sit right there for a minute before we start dinner?" For a moment I honestly thought Ashley was joking, because the chair in the center of the room looked so out of place that my mind could not quite accept it as real. But when no one laughed and no one explained anything, I slowly walked over and sat down just as she had asked, placing my purse neatly on my lap while the rest of the family watched in a silence that felt heavier with every passing second. From that chair I could see everyone clearly. Daniel stood near the fireplace with his hands in the pockets of his jeans, staring down at the carpet instead of looking at me. Ashley remained standing beside the dining table, her posture straight and composed like someone preparing to give a presentation. Around the room were familiar faces that had shared dozens of holidays with me over the years: Daniel's cousin Mark, his wife Linda, my sister Carol, and 2 of Ashley's relatives whom I had only met a few times before. Normally Thanksgiving meant laughter and the smell of turkey drifting from the kitchen, but that evening the house felt more like a quiet meeting room. I cleared my throat softly and said, "Did I miss something, or is there a reason I am sitting in the spotlight tonight?" I meant it lightly, hoping someone would finally break the tension, but Ashley stepped forward before anyone else could speak. She folded her hands together and gave the room a polite smile before turning toward me again. "Margaret," she said, "before we serve dinner we thought it might be a good idea for the family to talk about something important." The way she said the word important made the air feel even colder. I looked toward Daniel, expecting him to step in and explain, but he still had not raised his eyes. Ashley reached over to the coffee table and lifted a small wooden box that I had not noticed when I walked in. It looked like a decorative recipe box, the kind people keep note cards in, except this one was filled with small folded pieces of paper. She set it carefully on the table where everyone could see it. We have all been talking recently, she continued, about what is healthiest for our family moving forward. I blinked slowly, trying to follow what she meant. Families talk all the time, but the way she spoke made it sound like a board meeting rather than a holiday dinner. Ashley opened the box and removed a handful of folded slips, placing them neatly beside it. Tonight we thought it would be fair if everyone had a voice, she said, glancing around the room as though confirming that the others supported her plan. A few people nodded awkwardly. My sister Carol shifted in her seat and avoided looking at me. That was the first moment a small knot of unease settled into my stomach. Ashley picked up one of the slips and held it between her fingers. Each person here has a ballot, she explained. We are going to take a simple family vote. The words sounded so strange that I almost laughed again, but no one else seemed surprised. Instead, several relatives reached toward the coffee table where a stack of small pencils had been placed beside the slips of paper. The realization crept over me slowly, like a cold draft through an open door. This was not a casual conversation. This had been planned. I looked back at Daniel, hoping to catch his eye, hoping he would finally step forward and say that the whole thing had gone too far, but he only shifted his weight and rubbed the back of his neck. My voice came out quieter than I expected when I asked, Daniel, what exactly are we voting on? He hesitated. Long enough that Ashley answered for him. She spoke calmly, almost kindly, as though she were explaining house rules to a guest. Margaret, she said, we are voting on whether it might be better for everyone if you stepped back from certain family gatherings. The room became so silent that I could hear the faint ticking of the kitchen clock. For a moment I did not move at all, because it takes the mind a few seconds to accept something that unbelievable, and as I sat there in that single chair in the middle of the room surrounded by people who had shared years of holidays with me, I realized with a slow and sinking certainty that the seat Ashley had prepared for me was not meant for dinner at all. I sat there for several seconds without speaking because sometimes the mind needs a moment to catch up with what the ears have just heard, and while the room remained painfully quiet I slowly looked from one face to another trying to understand whether this was truly happening or whether I had misunderstood Ashley's words. No one corrected her. No one laughed and said it was only a joke before dinner. Instead Mark stared down at his hands, Linda adjusted the sleeve of her sweater as if she suddenly found it fascinating, and my own sister Carol looked toward the kitchen as though the clock on the wall had become the most important thing in the house. The silence told me more than any explanation could have. This had been discussed before tonight. I took a slow breath and folded my hands on my purse to keep them steady. You want to vote on whether I am allowed to attend family holidays, I said carefully, repeating the idea out loud so I could hear how strange it sounded. Ashley nodded as if I had simply summarized a meeting agenda. It is not meant to be cruel, she replied in that calm voice she used earlier. We just think it would be healthier for everyone if we addressed certain tensions openly. I glanced again at Daniel because no matter what Ashley believed, he was still my son and I expected him to speak at some point. When he finally looked up his expression carried a mixture of discomfort and hesitation that I had not seen since he was a teenager. Trying to explain a bad decision. Mom, he said quietly, this is just a conversation. The word conversation hung in the air like something fragile that could shatter if anyone spoke too loudly. I gave a small nod even though nothing about the situation felt like a conversation. It felt more like sitting in front of a panel that had already reached its conclusion. Ashley began handing out the folded slips of paper one by one, moving around the room with careful politeness. Each person received a pencil and a small ballot while avoiding direct eye contact with me. The paper was simple, just a small white card with two printed choices that I could see even from my chair. One option said that Margaret should continue attending family gatherings as usual. The other option suggested that Margaret should step back from future holidays for the sake of family harmony. Seeing my own name printed like that created a strange feeling in my chest, as though I had suddenly become a topic instead of a person. Ashley placed the final ballot beside the wooden box on the coffee table and turned back toward the group. "We will all write our choice privately," she explained. "Then we will place the ballots in the box and read the result together." My sister Carol shifted again and opened her mouth as if she might object, but the moment passed and she lowered her gaze to the card in her hand. One by one the pencils began to move. The soft scratching sound of graphite on paper seemed incredibly loud in that quiet living room. I watched them write while 1,000 memories passed through my mind, years of birthdays and holiday dinners and ordinary afternoons when these same people had sat at my table laughing over pie and coffee. It was difficult to understand how those moments had somehow led to the scene where they were voting on my place in the family. When everyone finished, Ashley lifted the wooden box and held it out. One by one the folded ballots disappeared inside until the box was full again. Daniel placed his in last and closed the lid with a soft click. Ashley set the box back on the table and rested both hands beside it. "All right," she said gently, "now we will see what the family thinks." At that moment I realized something important about the entire situation. They believed the result of that vote would decide my future at their table. But as I watched Ashley reach for the lid of the box, I felt a calm settle over me, because the truth was that this vote was about to reveal far more than they expected. The wooden box sat on the coffee table like something much heavier than it really was, and as Ashley slowly lifted the lid, the room seemed to hold its breath along with her. I watched her fingers move carefully, almost ceremoniously, as if she wanted the moment to feel official. One by one she began unfolding the small slips of paper and placing them into two neat piles on the table. No one spoke while she worked. The only sounds in the room were the quiet rustle of paper and the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen down the hallway. I remained seated in the center chair exactly where they had placed me, my hands folded calmly in my lap, because by that point there was nothing else to do except observe what they believed they had organized so perfectly. Ashley read each ballot silently at first before placing it into one of the piles. I could see her eyes moving back and forth as she counted, occasionally glancing toward Daniel as if confirming something between them without words. Daniel stood beside the fireplace with his arms crossed now, staring toward the coffee table with the tense expression of someone waiting for a difficult result. Mark leaned forward slightly on the couch, while Linda sat stiffly beside him, her fingers intertwined so tightly her knuckles had turned pale. My sister Carol still could not bring herself to look at me directly. The entire room felt suspended in that strange quiet that happens when people believe they are about to witness something final. After a few moments, Ashley finished sorting the ballots into the two piles and straightened them carefully so that their edges lined up perfectly. Then she looked up with a small controlled smile. "All right," she said softly, "let us see what the family decided." She lifted the first stack and counted the slips again just to be certain. I watched her expression very closely, because sometimes a person reveals more through their eyes than their words. At first her face showed the calm confidence she had worn all evening, the look of someone who believes everything is unfolding exactly as planned. But as she continued counting, I noticed the faintest pause between two ballots, almost too small for anyone else to notice. She quickly smoothed the stack again and cleared her throat. "The majority vote," she began, "suggests that it might be best if Margaret took a step back from certain family gatherings for a while." The words landed in the center of the room with a dull heaviness, and several people shifted in their seats as though the sentence itself made them uncomfortable. No one clapped. No one spoke. It was the quiet reaction of people who had participated in something but were not entirely proud of it once it became real. Ashley set the ballots back on the table and clasped her hands together again. "This does not mean anyone is angry," she added quickly. "It is simply what the family believes will reduce tension moving forward." I slowly turned my head toward Daniel because even after hearing the result I still wanted to know whether my son would say anything in that moment. For several seconds he remained completely still, his gaze fixed on the carpet as if he had lost something there. Finally he spoke in a low voice. "Mom, it is not permanent," he said. "It is just, maybe some space would help everyone." Hearing that sentence from him felt far heavier than the vote itself. Yet oddly enough, the calm inside me only grew stronger. I nodded once, as though I had been listening carefully to a proposal during a meeting rather than a judgment about my place in the family. Then I leaned forward slightly in my chair and spoke in a steady voice that surprised even me. Before we continue, I said, there is something I think all of you should see first. For a moment no one reacted to what I said, and I could feel the quiet confusion ripple through the room as the family tried to understand why I looked so calm after hearing the result of their vote. Ashley blinked slightly, clearly expecting anger or tears instead of the steady tone I had used. Daniel finally lifted his head and looked at me directly for the first time since I arrived. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice uncertain. I slowly reached down and opened my purse, moving carefully so everyone could see exactly what I was doing. Inside was a simple brown folder that I had placed there earlier that afternoon before driving over. I had not brought it with any plan to use it, but something about the unusual tone of Ashley's invitation had made me slip it into my bag just in case. I set the folder on my lap and rested my hands on top of it for a moment while the rest of the room watched. "You all took the time to organize a vote tonight," I said calmly. "And I respect that you want to discuss what is best for the family." My eyes moved slowly around the room, meeting each person's gaze one by one. Some looked away almost immediately, but others held my glance with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "But before anyone decides what role I should or should not have in this family," I continued, "I think it is only fair that everyone understands the full picture." Ashley shifted her weight slightly beside the coffee table. The confident expression she had worn earlier had begun to fade, replaced by a look of cautious uncertainty. "Margaret," she said carefully, "this does not have to become complicated." I offered a small polite smile. "It already became complicated the moment you printed ballots with my name on them," I replied gently. That comment caused a faint stir in the room, and Mark leaned back slightly on the couch while Linda exchanged a quick glance with him. Daniel rubbed his forehead as though the evening had suddenly become more exhausting than he expected. I opened the brown folder and removed several sheets of paper, placing them neatly on the coffee table next to the wooden ballot box. The documents were simple financial statements and copies of agreements that had been sitting in my filing cabinet at home for years. "Daniel," I said softly, turning toward my son, "do you remember when you and Ashley bought this house 4 years ago?" He nodded slowly. "Of course," he said. "You helped us with the down payment." I slid the first document across the table so everyone could see the heading clearly. "I did more than help," I said. "The entire down payment came from my savings account." No one spoke, so I continued calmly. I placed another paper beside the first. "And when Ashley started her small event planning business 2 years later, the startup loan that allowed her to rent office space and buy equipment also came from me." Ashley's face changed slightly at that sentence, the color in her cheeks fading as she looked at the papers now resting beside the ballot box. I did not raise my voice or speak with anger. My tone remained steady, almost conversational, because the truth rarely needs drama when it finally appears in the open. "I have always been happy to support my family," I said quietly. It never felt like a burden to me. The room remained completely silent as everyone looked between the documents and Ashley, and for the first time that evening the balance of the conversation had begun to shift in a way none of them seemed to expect. The silence that followed my words was deeper than anything that had happened earlier that evening, and for a moment no one seemed quite sure how to respond. The documents remained on the coffee table beside the wooden ballot box, the two objects sitting next to each other in a way that perfectly summarized the situation. On one side the family's carefully planned vote, and on the other side the quiet history they had apparently forgotten. Daniel leaned forward slightly and picked up the first paper, scanning the numbers across the page with growing tension in his face. "Mom," he said slowly, "you did not have to bring all of this up." His voice carried the uneasy tone of someone realizing that a conversation had suddenly taken a direction he did not expect. I watched him calmly. "You are right," I replied. I did not have to. But since we are discussing my role in the family tonight, it seemed appropriate to remind everyone how that role has looked over the years. Ashley remained standing beside the coffee table, her posture stiff now instead of confident. She glanced at the papers briefly and then looked back toward the rest of the room as though hoping someone else would speak first. Mark cleared his throat quietly, shifting on the couch as he studied the document Daniel still held. Linda leaned closer to read the page as well, her eyebrows rising slightly when she noticed the total amount printed near the bottom. I reached into the folder again and placed another document beside the others. There is also the education account for your daughter, I added gently, nodding toward Daniel and Ashley. The one that will cover her college tuition when she turns 18. Ashley's eyes moved immediately to that page, and for the first time since the evening began she looked genuinely unsettled. Margaret, she said carefully, no one is denying that you have been generous. Her voice tried to maintain its earlier calm, but the confidence had slipped away. Tonight was never about money. I nodded in agreement. I understand that, I said. And I never considered it about money either. I paused for a moment before continuing, letting the quiet fill the room again. But it is interesting that a family who believes I should step back from gatherings has never suggested stepping back from the support I have provided. That sentence settled over the room with quiet weight. Daniel slowly placed the document back on the table and rubbed his hands together as though trying to warm them. Mom, he said again, this is not what Ashley meant. I looked at him with a calm expression that held no anger, only a kind of tired clarity. Daniel, your wife organized a vote to decide whether I belong at this table, I said softly. It would be strange not to discuss the table itself. No one laughed at that remark, but several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. My sister Carol finally looked directly at Ashley for the first time all evening, her expression uncertain as if she had begun to reconsider the entire situation. Ashley drew in a slow breath and straightened her shoulders again. The point was to create healthy boundaries, she insisted, though the words sounded less certain than before. I folded my hands calmly on the table beside the documents and met her gaze without raising my voice. Boundaries are important, I agreed quietly. In fact, I believe tonight may be the perfect time for us to talk about them. At that moment everyone in the room seemed to sense that the conversation had shifted in a way that none of them had planned, and while the ballots in the wooden box had already been counted, the real decision of the evening had not yet been made. For several seconds after I mentioned boundaries no one spoke, and the quiet in the room felt very different from earlier that evening. Before, the silence had belonged to them, the silence of people who believed they were in control of the situation. Now the quiet felt uncertain, as if everyone was waiting to see where the conversation might go next. Ashley shifted slightly beside the coffee table and glanced again at the documents spread out near the wooden ballot box. The confidence she had shown when she first announced the family vote had almost completely disappeared. Daniel remained standing near the fireplace, his arms no longer crossed but hanging loosely at his sides as though he suddenly felt unsure what to do with them. I looked around the room slowly, meeting each person's eyes one by one. You mentioned healthy boundaries, I said calmly, directing my words toward Ashley but allowing everyone to hear them. And I think that is a very reasonable idea. My tone remained steady and respectful because raising my voice would not have helped anyone understand the point I was making. Families do need boundaries, I continued. They need honesty, fairness, and respect. Mark leaned forward slightly on the couch, listening with quiet attention now instead of the earlier discomfort. Linda's eyes moved between me and the documents as though she had begun to reconsider everything that had happened since I arrived. My sister Carol finally spoke, her voice cautious but sincere. Margaret, she said softly, no one expected tonight to turn into this. I gave her a small understanding nod. Neither did I replied gently. I believed I was coming here to share dinner with my family. That simple statement seemed to land heavily in the room. Ashley took a slow breath before speaking again. The intention was not to hurt you, she insisted. We just thought it might help everyone if certain tensions were addressed openly. I folded my hands together and considered her words carefully before responding. If openness is truly the goal, I said, then it should apply to every part of the situation, not only the parts that are convenient. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck again and looked down at the table. I could see the conflict on his face, the quiet realization that the evening had become far more complicated than he had expected. I reached over and gently straightened the papers on the table, aligning them beside the ballot box. The small gesture seemed almost symbolic now, the careful order of documents next to the scattered evidence of the vote they had taken. For many years I have supported this family in different ways, I said calmly. Not because I expected anything in return, but because that is what family means to me. My voice remained soft but clear so that every person in the room could hear each word. But tonight something important became very clear. Ashley looked at me with guarded attention, as though she sensed that the direction of the conversation was about to change again. I continued speaking with the same calm tone. If the family truly believes that distance will create peace, then perhaps we should all respect that idea fully. Mark exchanged another glance with Linda, both of them clearly beginning to understand what I meant. Daniel finally lifted his head and looked directly at me. "Mom," he said quietly, "what are you saying?" I met his eyes with the same calm expression I had maintained all evening. "I am saying that boundaries should work both ways," I answered. The words were not spoken with anger, only with a quiet certainty that had slowly grown stronger throughout the evening. And in that moment everyone in the room seemed to realize that the discussion about my place in the family had just become something much larger than the simple vote they thought would end it. Daniel's question remained hanging in the air for several seconds after I said that boundaries should work both ways, and the entire room seemed to lean forward slightly as though everyone suddenly realized that the discussion they had planned for me had quietly turned back toward them. I remained seated in the same chair in the center of the room, calm and steady, while the documents and the wooden ballot box rested side by side on the coffee table between us. "What I am saying," I continued gently, "is that if the family believes distance creates peace, then perhaps that idea deserves to be taken seriously by everyone, not only by me." Ashley folded her arms slowly, the movement more defensive than confident now. "Margaret, that is not what anyone meant," she replied quickly, though the firmness in her voice had weakened. Daniel stepped closer to the table, glancing down again at the papers that listed the down payment for the house and the financial support for Ashley's business. "Mom, you are making this sound like we are ungrateful," he said carefully. I shook my head once, not in anger but in quiet correction. "I am not making it sound like anything," I answered softly. "I am simply explaining what tonight's vote represents." I gestured lightly toward the ballot box. "You organized a decision about whether I should step back from family gatherings. That is a very clear boundary." Mark shifted on the couch again and rubbed his chin thoughtfully while Linda watched the conversation unfold with a look of growing concern. My sister Carol sat very still now, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Ashley spoke again, her tone trying to recover some authority. "The intention was just to reduce tension," she said. "No one wanted to create conflict." I allowed a small thoughtful pause before replying. "But conflict already existed," I said calmly. "Otherwise there would have been no vote." The room grew quiet again as those words settled in. Daniel looked at me with the uneasy expression of someone realizing that the situation had become far more complicated than he expected when the evening began. I gently gathered the documents into a neat stack and tapped the edges together so they aligned perfectly. "For many years I have tried to support this family however I could," I said in the same steady tone. "The house, the business loan, the education fund for your daughter. I never viewed those things as leverage. They were simply acts of care." Ashley lowered her gaze briefly toward the papers. I could see the tension building in her shoulders now, the earlier certainty replaced by something closer to unease. "But when a family formally votes on whether someone should step back," I continued quietly, "it changes the meaning of those contributions. Daniel opened his mouth to respond but hesitated, clearly unsure how to argue with the logic of what had just been said. I looked around the room again at each familiar face. So if distance is truly the healthiest path forward, I said, then perhaps it is time to respect that idea fully. Mark straightened slightly, beginning to understand where the conversation was leading. Linda placed a hand lightly on his arm as if silently acknowledging the same realization. Ashley's eyes returned to me quickly. "What exactly do you mean by fully?" she asked, her voice no longer steady. I met her gaze calmly. "It means that if the family believes I should step back from gatherings and decisions," I replied, "then it may also be time for me to step back from responsibilities that were never meant to be permanent." Daniel's face tightened with sudden concern as the meaning of that sentence became clear. The room fell completely silent again, and this time no one reached for the ballot box, because everyone understood that the real decision of the evening had just shifted to something they had never expected to vote on. The silence that followed my last sentence felt heavier than anything that had happened earlier that evening, because now everyone in the room understood exactly what I meant. Daniel stared at the stack of documents on the coffee table as if the numbers printed on them had suddenly become far more real than they ever had before. Ashley did not speak right away. Her arms remained folded, but the confident posture she had shown at the beginning of the evening was gone, replaced by a stiffness that looked more like uncertainty than control. Mark leaned back slowly on the couch while Linda kept her eyes on the table, her expression thoughtful in a way that suggested she was reconsidering the entire situation from the beginning. I remained seated calmly in the chair they had placed in the center of the room, my hands resting lightly on my lap. No anger, no raised voice, only the quiet patience of someone who had already accepted the truth of the moment. Daniel finally spoke first. "Mom," he said, his voice lower now, "there is no reason to make big decisions tonight." I looked at him gently, the same way I had looked at him many times over the years when he was unsure of something important. "Daniel," I said softly, "the decision was already made tonight." My eyes moved briefly toward the wooden ballot box still sitting beside the documents. "You all took a vote about my place in the family. That is a very big decision." No one argued with that. Ashley shifted slightly where she stood, glancing at the ballot box as if seeing it differently now. The neat little stack of folded papers no longer looked clever or organized. It looked small. I leaned forward just enough to gather the documents back into the brown folder, sliding them carefully together. For many years I believed that supporting this family meant helping wherever I could, I continued in a steady voice. And I do not regret any of it. Not the house, not the business loan, not the education account for your daughter. Those things were given out of love. Daniel lowered his head slightly when I said that. Ashley looked toward the floor for a moment before meeting my eyes again. "But love should never be something that needs to defend its place at the table," I added quietly. The words settled over the room in a way that no one seemed able to interrupt. I stood up slowly from the chair they had placed for me, smoothing the front of my coat as I did. No one moved to stop me. No one even seemed sure whether they should. I placed the brown folder back into my purse and picked it up from the chair. "If distance is what this family believes will bring peace," I said calmly, "then I will respect that." Daniel looked up quickly as if he wanted to respond, but the words did not come out. Ashley remained silent, her earlier confidence replaced by a tight, uncertain expression. I walked toward the front door at an unhurried pace, passing the dining table that had been set for Thanksgiving dinner but never used. The smell of the turkey still drifted faintly from the kitchen, a reminder of the evening everyone thought they were going to have. When I reached the door I paused for just a moment, not to argue or explain anything further, but simply to look back at the room one last time. No one could meet my eyes except Mark, who gave a small, uncomfortable nod of respect. Ashley stood beside the coffee table with the ballot box still in front of her, and for the first time that evening she looked like someone who understood the full weight of what had just happened. I opened the door quietly and stepped outside into the cold November air, leaving the house behind me along with the silence that none of them seemed able to break.